Hi, my name is Brandon Finn. I'm a PhD candidate at Harvard University, and I'm currently affiliated with the African Studies Center here at University of Michigan, as well as the Center for Political Studies at ISR. And it's wonderful to be here with you and to get to engage with three fascinating papers, and I'm sure speakers that are about to speak. And so the main heading for this upcoming panel is countering narratives. How it'll work, I'll introduce each speaker individually. They'll come up, make their presentation, and then I'll introduce the next one. And thereafter, I'll give a few comments and questions directed to each, and then open up to everyone here. And so we have three very diverse areas of research with multiple research focuses. And all the academics and studies attempt to destabilize some of the theoretical assumptions or presuppositions that we may have on the topic of migration. The topic of migration and its relationship to borders, boundaries, and belonging. The first speaker is Dr. Mark Overmyer Velasquez, who is Professor of History and Latino and Latin American Studies at the University of Connecticut. His paper is titled Global Latinx Americanos, Charting New Ontological and Epistemological Cartographies Beyond US Latinx Studies. This paper will seek to deal with the flow of transoceanic market capital and the growing of globalization and this impacts on the identities of the diasporic Latin American and Caribbean communities subsequent to their migration to non-US locations. Please present Dr. Mark Overmyer Velasquez. Thank you.
Good morning. Buenos dias. Thanks, Brandon. And thanks to the International Institute and to Tori Langland, who invited me here, and also, of course, to Neil and to Alana Rodriguez for all the schlepping and organizing and stuff. I have no slides. Going old school here. So let me start with some comments on the origins of this paper. This is a bit departure for me in the sense, as you'll get a sense when I read this origins, where my kind of intellectual background comes from and how I ended up here. And these are a bunch of fragments I'm gonna mention to you, and how these different personal and professional scholarly fragments have kind of ended up into this paper. And they're, as Brandon pointed out, they're really kind of helped me to think about disrupting notions of kind of national fixity, of identities, of borders, of these kinds of things in larger conversations and thinking around migration in and beyond Latin America. So a couple fragments. So I get my PhD in Latin American history, and my first job, and my work was primarily on modern Mexican history. My first job was teaching in the second oldest Chicano Studies department in California. And right away, I witnessed how Mexico kind of either dropped out of the conversation in Chicano studies, Chicanx studies, or was sort of stylized and essentialized. And similarly, when I was in Mexico with my family, or kind of reading about the US Latinos also became kind of stylized and essentialized in the way. So there wasn't a lot of dialogue between these two spaces, the diasporic space and the home space, or vice versa. I was born in Chicago, but I grew up in Canada, and so in the 1980s, being Mexican American in Canada wasn't a thing, especially on the West Coast. So kind of thinking about my own kind of identitarian politics and the conflicts and trying to locate myself within these larger conversations was very difficult. And moving forward through graduate school, and my main intellectual professional home was the Latin American Studies Association. And in the Latin American Studies Association, for a long time, and still into the present, had a real tension around how to understand migrants and migration within Latin America, and those to locations outside of Latin America, not to the US, and then people from Latin America and the Caribbean to the United States, and people weren't able to have conversations, and the kind of methodologies and the theorizing never kind of found a place of intersection in those different places. And then recently, as you'll see in this paper, my travels abroad to places like the Middle East and my experience in Canada, trying to rethink this notion of Latinidad, Latin Americanness, or Latino-ness outside of the U.S. So bringing these into conversation. And I should say, in some ways, I have much to learn from Professor Sakyan and your work on this piece of the tension between diaspora communities and dispersed migrant collectivities. And as you'll see, I think the communities in Jordan and Amman, Jordan are more sort of these emergent communities. In Canada, is beyond that, and of course the United States is well established. So I'll go right into it then. So, introduction. As we passed the sweet kanefa around the table for dessert, the assorted dinner guests shared their experience of being, quote, Latino in Amman, Jordan. It was June 2013, and I was visiting the University of Jordan for the first time to support their work in establishing a new center for Latin American studies. Referring to themselves as, quote, Latinos, the guests included members of the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora, some of Arab descent, from countries such as Colombia, Chile, the Dominican Republic. Our conversation shifted from how to advance research and teaching at the newly launched center, the first of its kind in the Arab world, to discussion of global Latinidades. The local negotiation, redefinition, and Latino self-identification of members of Latin American and Caribbean diaspora in Amman challenged me to add global extra-Western hemispheric mobility to the interdisciplinary and transnational dimensions of U.S. Latino studies. So my presentation today examines how situating our academic inquiry from geographic vantage points outside of the United States allows scholars to recast epistemological and ontological assumptions in the field of U.S. Latino studies, to recast how we think about and create knowledge and notions of belonging as Latinxes inside and outside of the U.S. It asks how, from a global reorientation of the cognitive map of U.S. Latino studies, we might reconsider the experience of Latin American and Caribbean diaspora and the notion of Latinidad in places such as Jordan, Spain, and Canada. This analysis places Latino studies and Latin American and Caribbean studies into conversation by reconsidering their status as traditionally isolated epistemic sites of U.S. ethnic and area studies. In addition, it explores how new Latino and diasporic identities are forged through hybrid ethnic interactions among minoritized populations in the global South. This recharting of global epistemological and ontological cartographies initially seemed jarring in the context of established geographic and identitarian diasporic norms in U.S. Latino studies. Yet, as I'll discuss in a bit, the ever-increasing movement of the region's population to non-U.S. destinations required new ways of locating and naming this global diasporic community. So a quick note on language. This paper was written and kind of conceived for a kind of Latino studies audience, so I can't assume you all are immersed in the jargon. But here I'm following scholars like Nicole Giudetti Hernandez, in keeping with a disruptive critical logic of Latinx studies. Today I'm interchanging between Latina, Latino, Latinx, Latinxes, global. So there's a lot of kind of neologisms that are kind of fun and disrupting and annoying, and we can talk about how you feel about that later. But I think they're great and important and a movement in the right direction for this kind of work. So further blurring distinctions between geographies and populations in the global South, I also was in Amman conducting comparative research on the history of Arab and Latin American relations and the respective regions' experience with immigrants and other minoritized populations. That project examines two major political and migratory shifts that have occurred in and altered the relationship between Latin America and the Arab world in recent decades. These two regions share historical ties dating to the 15th century and today are connected by a population of over 20 million people of Arab heritage living in Latin America, constituting the largest Arab diaspora in the world. The year before, while in attendance at the third Arab Latin America Forum held in Abu Dhabi, I heard political, business, and academic leaders assert what many inhabitants of both regions have known for quite some time. Latin America and the Arab world have over 500 years of shared histories, strong complementarities, and mutual interests that remain largely untapped and little examined. Due in part to the West's historical dominance in academic production, more often than not, debates and studies by Arab and Latin American scholars have remained focused on their own regions or in dialogue with colleagues in Western Europe and the United States. Scholars from and specialists on Latin America and the Middle East are only beginning to engage each other in sustained comparative and collaborative research. Insinuating a Latinx studies optic into this inter- and transnational encounter further complicates traditional notions of Aryan ethnic studies as understood from US and non-US academic sites of knowledge production. Building on a rich literature, examining and highlighting post-colonial epistemologies from the South, this intervention also contributes to transnational dialogues in the Global South. The self-proclaimed Latino population in Amman is small and hard to quantify with no official census records or demographic studies yet available. However, returning in 2018, my inchoate ethnographic research on Latin American and Caribbean origin and descent population in Jordan suggests that this emergent population is establishing a Latino identity and common places of cultural orientation. Furthermore, my preliminary examination shows that the majority, if not all of the population, migrated directly from Latin America and the Caribbean and not via the United States. My hope is that this perspective and preliminary overview will prompt more rigorous analysis of this population information in places such as Amman. Residents of Amman employ the term Latino in two ways in the capital city, the country's primary home to Jordanian Latinxes. I'm guessing that term Jordanian Latinxes, if you Google it, you'll find zero, but give it a shot. Members of the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora use, quote, Latino to self-identify and to distinguish themselves from the larger Hispanic community from Spain. At the same time, non-Latinx and Spanish residents deploy the term Latino in a more general fashion to designate all Spanish-speaking individuals. Centered around common foodways, expressive cultures, and the Spanish language, members of the Latinx diaspora have found a cultural home in Amman. Amman institutions such as the Arriba Latino Pub and Restaurant and the Centro Cultural Latinoamericano, where they participate in Noches de Baile Latino and the annual Festival de Cine Latino. Reinforcing Mexicanness as a dominant Latino form and perpetuating the erroneous notion of May 5th as Mexico's Independence Day, international travelers and Amman's elite also have access to the Cinco de Mayo restaurant located in the Hotel Intercontinental. My academic and international encounters in Jordan led me to reconsider the more general experience of Latin American and Caribbean migrants to non-US destinations. In turn, those preoccupations led to my co-edited volume, Global Latinoamericanos, Transoceanic Diasporas, and Regional Migrations, which shifts our analytical lens away from US dominant interpretations of migration from the region to document and examine the growing flow between and within destinations in the Global South and across the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. So today I'll share and further develop some of the conclusions from that volume. Latin America and the Caribbean have long been important destinations for global migrants. In recent years, however, they have also become sites of emigration. After 4.5 centuries of immigration to Latin America and the Caribbean, starting with the arrival of Europeans, Africans, and Asians to the Americas during the colonial period, the flow of migrants has changed directions. In the decades following World War II, economic growth and liberalized immigration policies in Europe and Asia, and demographic expansion and repressive regimes in Latin America and the Caribbean contributed to a period of intensified migration. Internal migration developed from rural to urban areas, especially to capitals and metropolises of Latin America. In the 1970s, migration flows started between countries in the region and to the United States and Canada. towards the end of the 20th century, and with increasingly muscular U.S. state security and border militarization following September 11, 2001, immigrants looked to resettle in Europe and Asia. By the end of the first decade of the 21st century, the contribution of Latin America and the Caribbean to international migration amounted to over 32 million people, or 15% of the world's international migrants. Although most have headed north of the Rio Grande, Bravo, and Miami, in the past decade, Latin America and the Caribbean migrants have traveled to new destinations, both within the hemisphere and to countries in Europe and Asia in greater rates than to the United States. The diversity of these origins and destinations has not received balanced academic treatment. Studies of US-bound migration have dominated the literature, reinforcing the sense of dependence, domination, and attraction exercised by the United States over the whole region. Although scholars have conducted significant research examining the flow of transoceanic market capital, the growing globalization of Latin American and Caribbean migration to non-US destinations, and its attendant consequences for reshaping diasporic identities and Latino studies requires further examination. Furthermore, this inquiry allows us to enrich and broaden our theoretical conversations and substantive knowledge about how the region's migrants participate in and negotiate globalization. So some scholars, government elites, marketing professionals, and others historically have used the term, quote, global in relation to Latinos and Latin Americans in a variety of ways. Various individuals and institutions most often use, quote, global Latinos and its cognates to describe the diversity of the Latin American and Caribbean population in the United States, particularly at the intersection of cultural production, capital accumulation, and mass marketing. For example, Nicole Giudotti Hernandez's study of the children's cartoon Dora the Explorer, Dora la Exploradora, examines, quote, the shifting train of a globalized juvenile Latino-Latina television market and the construction of a, quote, universal Latino subjectivity. Events such as the International Latino Cultural Center of Chicago's Global Latino Fest celebrated pan-Latino art forms and promoted the richness and great diversity found in more than 20 Latino nations in the United States, unquote. Scholars examining these sites of ethnocultural production in the United States underscore how pan-Latina characters such as Dora are, quote, developing idea that harbors Latino and Latina entanglements and out-of-placeness. In other words, the global is seen both as a way to capture and absorb the multiplicity of potential hemispheric national identities and signal how the inter- and transnationalness of Latinx is hostile to a U.S. national place-based identity. Or, as a misperception goes, if Latinos are global, they cannot be citizens of a singular nation. Latino studies scholars increasingly have interrogated the experience of U.S. Latinos beyond the context of the nation state. The editors and authors of Tecnofuturos, Critical Interventions in Latino Studies, examine the connection between globality and Latinidad, where Latinidad is both a production and a sense of collective identity among people of Latin American descent. The authors ask, quote, do definitions of Latino identity, Latino political formations, research and thinking change when we move past the nation state to a more globalized framework? With a focus on how global forces and exchanges impact Latinos in the United States, the contributors study topics such as transnational migration, mass media, and gang membership, which expand their, quote, understanding of global Latinidades. While Latin Americans only recently have been moving in greater numbers to non-US destinations, Latin American political and cultural influences have circulated globally since well before the national period, and I discuss this in the larger paper. While most members of the Latin American diaspora in the region identify themselves by their national or subnational affiliations, for example, Peruvian or Dominican, Latin Americans living outside Latin America utilize additional identifiers depending on particular local contexts. As authors in Global Latinoamericanos describe, there are people self-identifying as Latinos in Canada, Israel, Jordan, Spain, and elsewhere. This existence of self-proclaimed Latinos in the non-US based Latin American diaspora challenges assertions by scholars that limit the notion of Latino and Latinidad solely to the United States. Some questions about that. I'm going to skip a little bit. While the experience of colonialism among U.S. Latina Latinos has been particularly critical in shaping their formation as a diaspora community, migrants moving between Latin American countries and overseas have shared similar experiences of labor exploitation, inequality, and racialization as they live and work as vulnerable minorities. Indeed, those similarities have most likely contributed to the use of the term Latinos by Latin Americans in the non-US diaspora to refer to themselves in places such as Canada, Spain, Jordan, and Italy. Scholars have differing opinions on the origins, emergence, and the use of pan-ethnic Latino identity in host countries. Doug Massey argues, for example, drawing on the case of the United States, that the potential for a Latino identity is greatest when the Latino population is large and diverse. There is a significant cultural and linguistic distance between the destination country and Latin America, greater exposure to the processes of exclusion and discrimination, and greater economic exploitation at the hands of natives. Yet, for example, in contrast, Canada's relatively small Latino community has organized and identified itself as Latinos in cities throughout the country. Similar examples emerge in Spain and elsewhere. Understanding how Latino diaspora communities mediate membership and social belonging from the bottom up helps us, as Ben Habib argues, to avoid the false dichotomy that forces a choice between the nation state and other forms of attachments, whether they be to ethnocultural groups or larger federal states. I go on to have a discussion here about the tensions between ethnic and area studies, and especially U.S. institutions, and how these kinds of studies of global Latinidades and global Latinos, for example, don't sit well in either of them, and we can talk certainly more about that in the question and answer period. More broadly, as an epistemic concept, global Latino-Americanos contributes to the longstanding discussions and collaborations that center post-colonial sites of knowledge production in the global South as antidotes to production in the hegemonic West/global North. Following scholars such as Boaventura de Sousa Santos and Aníbal Quijano, global Latinoamericanos recognizes and promotes, quote, different ways of knowing by which people across the globe run their lives and provide meaning to their existence. Fundamental to this line of thinking is a focus on establishing networks of solidarity in the global South that counter the historical, systematic marginalization and, quote, epistemicide of non-Western knowledge, or what Quijano calls the coloniality of power. And in my conclusion, I go back, of course, and summarize the arguments and ask questions that I think need to be explored. For example, what are the relationships between, for example, the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora in places like Jordan with other minoritized diaspora communities that are not aren't speaking Spanish, aren't from Latin America, and how do these kind of broader global trends impact both the identities and practices and experience of those people, but also their relationship to their home countries. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you for a fascinating talk, Dr. Overmeyer Velasquez. The next speaker is Dr. Nicole Constable, who's a professor of anthropology and women and gender study and sexuality studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Her paper addresses issues of exclusion and belonging among migrant mothers in Hong Kong. Dr. Constable asks us to understand non-citizenship as a term that is heterogeneous and complex, a term that is fully attendant to the notions of belonging, exclusion, and temporariness. Thank you, Dr. Constable.
That's great. That's good. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to Neil and to Brandon and to all the other people who have been involved in organizing this. It's been beautifully well organized, and it's really a pleasure to be here. So just to go forward, I just do enter. Is that right? Or is it? Oh, okay. Oh, great. This one. Good. Thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about migrant mothers, rejected refugees, and excluded belonging in Hong Kong. And I'm going to cover a lot of ground and leave a lot of gaps. So I'm sure there will be some questions. So I'm happy to address them later on. The wider context of the paper that I'm talking about is in conversation with a lot of Europeanists who are very concerned about the refugee crisis, and some of whom are very critical of this idea of how there's a kind of strong binary between migrants and refugees, and this idea of exceptionalizing migrants versus migrants and refugees versus citizens. And so this is part of the critique of reifying the migrant-citizen binary, which from the papers already today we can tell is already problematic, and questioning the migrant container and the state container, and pointing attention to the messy, complex categories of belonging and exclusion, as we've already seen to some extent. And so the argument is for the need to de-exceptionalize displacement. And some of the scholars whose work I'm conversing with and building on are Janine de Hinden, Bridget Anderson, Heath Cabot, Georgina Ramsey, and many others. So my work is situated within the wider context of Hong Kong, which much in the news these days. As you know, it's a special administrative region of China, officially under the one country, two systems governance system, which people are not entirely convinced exists that much anymore. And the category Hengongyan in Cantonese has taken on major significance these days in the sense of feeling like they're different from mainland Chinese. They don't identify, or a lot of people don't identify so much as Chinese, but as Hong Kong people. And another new administrative category that has become important in my work anyway is the NECII. There was NEC before that immigration used a lot in Hong Kong, but NECII is the non-ethnic Chinese illegal immigrant. And so part of the context of this paper is that in the last 3 years, I noticed that a lot of the migrant workers who I knew who had previously already overstayed and had children there and filed asylum or non-refoulement claims thought the situation was much, much worse than it had been before. And they kept telling me all kinds of things about how much worse things had become. And so it really is a change from a few years ago when they all thought they'd be able to stretch it out and stay forever, one way or another. All of a sudden, people were very panicked and concerned about what was going on. So the concept that I'm talking about today, I call excluded belonging. And excluded belonging is both a process and a condition. And the example that I'm going to talk about to make sense of this is Southeast Asian migrant mothers in Hong Kong. They were all before migrant domestic workers on 2-year contracts. And at some point, they overstayed their contracts and usually because they were pregnant, in a couple of cases got pregnant afterwards and stayed in Hong Kong. These are all Filipino and Indonesian migrant women who I'm talking about. So as a process, excluded belonging is shaped by wider assemblages of non-citizenship and shifting parameters of inclusion and exclusion that's experienced by non-citizens. And this includes policies and all kinds of things, as well as practices that are shifting through time. Such migratory assemblages involve laws and policies pertaining to different classifications of non-citizens and to shifting rights and entitlements. and processes also linked to local labor needs, sort of whether they need them or not, whether they want them to stay or not, whether they're useful or not, and this whole idea of flexible labor. So it's tied also to social structures and to international ideas about human rights. As a condition, excluded belonging takes shape through interactions between agents of the state and civil society and non-citizens. It includes subjective experiences of non-citizens as they work, they strategize, they worry, they learn about, and they resist shifting inclusionary and exclusionary parameters. It includes migrant struggles and negotiations with various agents to maintain a substantive sense of belonging in their everyday lives and in the face of differential inclusion. So I apologize for the next 3 slides that are pretty full of words, but I'll go over them fairly quickly, and you can also ignore them if you choose. So differential exclusion, as some of you are probably aware, highlights intersectional forms of gender, class, and race, ethnicity, nationality-based discrimination, and points to the effects of negotiations between governmental practices, sovereign gestures, and so on. Excluded belonging is a condition that results from the struggles to belong despite differential inclusion and formal exclusion. It builds on distinctions between emotions of belonging and politics of belonging that challenge state boundaries and definitions of membership. Excluded belonging often remains, as in the cases that I write about, fragile and fleeting. It takes place in everyday spaces within which formal citizenship can be more or less consequential. And we see it in examples in the paper, that some of which I'll discuss, having to do with food and shelter and schooling, basic needs. So the migrant mothers that I'm talking about, as I said, are Indonesian and Filipino. They've gone from being foreign domestic workers, that's the foreign domestic helpers is the official category, to overstayers, to non-refoulement claimants or asylum seekers. This builds on my research of 50 migrant mothers that I wrote about in a book published in 2014 called Born Out of Place, and subsequent research that I've done every summer since through 2019. What was evident was the growing anxieties among the 12 mothers who I followed in relation to migratory pathways and assemblages that have structured their exclusion and that of their children through time. The process of excluded belonging is largely exclusionary and creates a sense of precarity, but it also provides openings and opportunities through which to prolong and claim certain forms of social support, though limited, and it creates and prolongs then their situation of excluded belonging. Formal citizenship or right of abode or permanent residence is out of the question for migrant domestic workers. The only way they could ever get it is if they marry a local who can support them and so on. And that happens, but not among the people who I knew for this particular study. So they labor and struggle for substantive belonging in a situation where they know they won't legally be able to stay in Hong Kong permanently. But this is a kind of lived, prolonged, paradoxical condition that is, I think, representative of wider situations of mobility as well. Rather than a state of sustained liminality, or as Menjivar writes, or of non-existence, as Susan Coutinho writes, excluded belonging is better seen, I think, as simultaneous fluctuating combination of exclusion and belonging, as fleeting moments or periods of belonging and non-belonging within temporal and geographic spaces. It involves labor on the part of the individuals in the sense of activities that fulfill their basic needs, and struggles to belong despite the ultimate impossibility of permanence. The specter of deportation is heightened or lessened, but it's always there. So what got me interested in this topic in particular were stories that I kept hearing over the last 3 summers about rumors of deportation. And these stories were rampant. And I'll read you just a couple of the quotes as excerpts here. It's a difficult situation this time, one woman told me, because so many people cannot work, so many people getting worried. The lady chief executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, she does not like the refugees. She's trying to slowly send people home. And another one said, I heard some people left voluntarily, but I heard some say 2 months ago that the plane was full and was deported. They, and I don't know how true that is, and all of these are with, I don't know how true that is, or someone told me, very much the sort of hearsay rumor, but that these people were asleep when they were on the plane. Asleep, I ask? Yes, drugged, she said. They say that everybody who's on that plane, they're all sleeping. They woke up, they're already there in that country. They say most are from Pakistan and Bangladesh. Most are Pakistan, and then Vietnam, I think. They say the source is a lawyer here, so I don't know how true, but that's the news about the plane that's all over. And another one, everybody, all asylum seekers know about that story, but nobody can confirm it. Before I heard if you refuse to go, unless you sign, they have to delay. They can't force you to leave. But now, according to what I heard, they stop it. That plane, one Pakistani person died in the airport. He was killed in the airport just after landing, going home, something like that. And I say, killed because he's an asylum seeker? Yes, maybe that's why they say immigration is a bit not as strict about this thing. I don't know if it's true as well, but those people say the story of the plane is true. And another one, some people confirmed that some of their friends are not here anymore, and then they say, we're already there. And they say, huh? How come? And they say, by force. And final one, many people tell me that people are already in CIC, Castle Peak Immigration Center and Detention Center, and they really saw it in their eyes. They already sit in the wheelchair, and they're like sleeping. They said someone injected them at immigration, and they're all crying. At immigration, they say they don't want to go, and after that, I think they do it, inject them forcibly. And they say when they woke up, they say they're already in their country. So these rumors, I actually did track down some stuff in the news about the actual deportations that did occur, and they were of Vietnamese people, and it was covered in the news. But what's most interesting is the part that's not in the news. So things like being drugged or sedated, an imagined response to resistance means being forced to go home without the ability to fight or express opposition. As one mother put it, the fear was visible in their eyes. And airline objections, the other part of the story is that airlines supposedly objected to flying with such unruly passengers, which seemed to offer them hope that such operations might slow down. The death of a deportee upon return implies that non-refoulement claims were valid but improperly evaluated. The murdered asylum seeker tragically embodies the substantiation of his claim. So awakening in one's home country with no memory of how you got there may be these mothers' worst nightmare. How did we get there has special resonance for them. So the body of the paper then turns to 2 main sections. One, that's the wider assemblages and shifting strategies in Hong Kong. And the main points there are, I go into a lot of the policies and strategies and assemblages in which foreign domestic workers have maternity rights or not, and I'm not going to go into that one here, but I'm happy to answer any questions. The next part has to do with non-refoulement claims and non-ethnic Chinese and how they're constructed into this category and the anxiety locally about them. And then the third part has to do with accelerated immigration department enforcement. And this table here illustrates the outstanding claims in 2015, almost 11,000, and then by September of 2019, down to 297. What it doesn't explain is what happened to these people. And one of the new terms that's also come up is that double overstayers, just people who just stop reporting to immigration in order to try and stay. And then here, this next slide is from the newspaper article of the actual deportation that was shot and put on the news, and that they actually even have a video of it on YouTube. The next section is about the everyday tactics and exclusions and how women respond to different kinds of issues around the non-refoulement claims. And there I talk about how some of them will piggyback their cases and those of their children with their partners or the husbands or the father of the children's, because often they're not actually married, their claims as well. And so a lot of the men are from South Asia or from Africa, and they can try to get the children and themselves onto those claims. The second category has to do with food and rent and how it's become increasingly difficult when they go to international social services to get what's usually paid in kind to the landlord, and different tactics of giving them documentation that allows them a tiny little bit of food each month. And that's gone from food in kind to food coupons to now like this biometric identity card that's supposed to be enforced by the shop clerks, who of course probably couldn't care less because they're not paid to police these people, but how they've devised different strategies to sell their food coupons or their food cards, or rent them out to people to get money where they otherwise couldn't get it. And then the third category has to do with education and the struggles they have and the experiences they have to get education for their children. And that's probably the most important motivation that these women have. So finally, to sum up, and this part I'm going to read so that I can get the details more appropriately. So situated in relation to the scholarship on non-citizenship and the wider critique of reductionist binaries of citizen and non-citizen, this paper contributes to the view that non-citizens are not the inverse of citizens. Non-citizenship, as this paper shows, is, and all the other papers so far that we've heard, is heterogeneous and complex and is constituted by the social, political, and legal contexts through which non-citizens navigate. The complex and ever-shifting assemblage of non-citizenship involves laws, policies, procedures that engage dynamically and formally and informally with individual non-citizens. Non-citizens, especially immigrants and refugees, have been described in terms of their liminal legality, an in-between status that shapes many spheres of immigrant lives, as Menjivar describes, or in relation to being legally non-existent or dismembered, as Coutinho writes, or differentially included, as Di Genova and others have written. I've argued for the importance of looking carefully at the heterogeneity of non-citizens in relation to their permanent temporariness and their experiences and tactics. Excluded belonging is a process through which particular non-citizens, in this case migrant mothers with their children whose non-refoulement claims have expired, continue continue to exert energy and struggle. They work, they labor to belong and maintain in Hong Kong despite their growing knowledge and understanding of temporary belonging in the face of increasingly exclusionary regulatory structures. Excluded belonging involves an everyday process of creating and asserting a state of belonging, despite the processes of individual inclusion and exclusion, including the growing specter and spectacle of deportation. Excluded belonging is aimed at and responds to different aspects of the non-citizen assemblage. It includes working within legal frameworks by reporting, registering, following certain rules, and contesting others by working illegally, accessing and negotiating with agencies, churches, NGOs for resources and food, and housing allowances and educational resources. It also involves staying abreast of the news, the rumors, the gossip that reinforce understandings of exclusion and reinforce the tenuous, fragile, and brittle claims to belonging. It includes tactics for acquiring and earning money. Thus, excluded belonging refers to actions that take place within the wider context of laws and policies pertaining to non-citizenship that are manifest in everyday behaviors and subjectivities and the tactics of non-citizens. The multiple subjectivities of migrant mothers constantly shift in relation to their roles as mothers of school children, for example, who appear to belong at times, but then are harshly reminded that they're different when, for example, they cannot afford the school transportation fees for their children, or their children cannot go with their classmates on field trips to the border, across the border into China, because they have no travel documents. Excluded belonging results from ever-changing macro-level migratory assemblages and micro-level shifting experiences and tactics on the ground. As in the case of migrant mothers in Hong Kong, excluded belonging develops in response to shifting circumstances, shifting policies, and processes and non-citizens' simultaneous understandings of their exclusion and their ongoing struggles to establish and maintain partial and paradoxical belonging within an ever-shifting migratory context. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Constable, for that fascinating presentation. The third speaker is Dr. Jatin Dua, who is the Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Michigan. Speaking on the ever-changing political nature of migration and mobility in the Indian Ocean, Dr. Dua contends that the sea is not an empty space. Indeed, it is constantly produced, managed, and a negotiated space, where political and economic negotiations take place across multiple scales, from the geopolitical to the ontological. Dr. Dua, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brendan, for the introduction. Thank you, Neil, and for all the other speakers. This has been a really sort of rich conversation so far. I have to begin with a bit of a kind of confession in the sense that I am an interloper of sorts in this. My research doesn't necessarily focus on migration per se, but rather on mobility and its interruption in the Indian Ocean. So what I present here is a bit of an experiment. This comes from my recently published book manuscript entitled Captured at Sea, Piracy and Protection in the Indian Ocean, which locates piracy within longer histories of mobility and exchange in the Indian Ocean, as well as beyond it by looking at its connections to questions around insurance and risk management more broadly. So here I want to think about some specific ethnographic encounters from that work as a way to think through, as Brandon very nicely sort of elucidated, the kind of materiality of movement in terms of thinking of what the space of the sea and the kinds of vessels and objects that make movement and mobility across oceanic space possible, what that materiality has to say about migration and the relationality that is engendered in these spaces of transit. The water in Ras Asir is the bluest water you will ever see, We were on our way to the lighthouse of Ras Asir, which marks the spot where the Red Sea meets the Indian Ocean. At the beginning of the 19th century, this mostly mist-covered promontory had become infamous as a graveyard for ships making their way from the relative calm of Aden or Berbera in the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. During the southwest monsoon, when strong currents and gusty winds blow from the south, ships would often get caught in whirlpools and find themselves thrown westward towards this treacherous rocky coast. Shipwrecks provided the Majrutin inhabitants of this area with a steady source of profit, and importantly, the flotsam and jetsam of these wrecks was their ticket into the world of Indian Ocean trade and a source of political power on land. To curb this annual share of shipwrecks and end this profitable salvage economy, the construction of a lighthouse was proposed by both the British and later Italian protectorates in the 19th century. After many years of protest, including acts of sabotage, a lighthouse was finally constructed in 1924, bringing to an end the shipwreck economy. And you can kind of see the lighthouse over in the distance there. In 2011, this part of the Somali coastline was dotted with cargo ships that had been hijacked on the adjacent lanes of global maritime commerce. Inhospitable roadblocks meant that we never made it to the lighthouse, but Usman, a self-proclaimed historian of the Bari, the coast, and my companion for this trip, promised a quick detour to a former shipwreck village before the long journey back to Bosaso. Later that evening in the fading light, as Usman's friend Shirmayo regaled us with tales of shipwrecks that had been the mainstay of the coastal economy, the conversation turned to piracy. Shirmayo noted that piracy had at least made the Somali coast famous. People know we exist. Before piracy, we used to sit patiently hoping and praying to get a gift from the sea. Our ancestors found shipwrecks, but the Europeans ended that when they came. Then came containers, he said, referring to the widespread dumping of containers full of toxic waste along the Somali coast. I think pirates maybe have an answer, he explained. Today, you cannot go out and you cannot just wait for a gift from the sea. You might get poison. You have to be like these men, the pirates, he gestured. You have to go out to sea and bring the gift of the sea home. The sea has many gifts. At times, these gifts wash ashore, often unexpectedly and without asking. From shipwrecks to toxic containers, these unexpected surfacings contain possibilities and perils. Their sudden arrivals make visible entanglements and obligations, including toxic obligations. At other times, one leaves land to possess the bounty of the ocean. For millennia, those who inhabit the port cities and villages of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean have sought to cross the threshold of land and sea and transform their world by bringing back gifts from the ocean. In Somalia, to go to sea is to become a badmah, a seafarer, a term that is used both to refer both to those who work at sea, but also those who travel to foreign lands in search of wealth and prestige. To go to sea is to leave with the anticipation of a heroic return amongst those left behind. The sea and its gifts in this way make people and places bigger. As Shirmayo reminded me, thanks to the pirates, people know Somalia. Now they know that a small fishing boat can take over a large container ship. To be feared, as he explained, is also a form of status in the world. Somali pirates, like many other itinerant sojourners throughout the world's oceans, know that violence too marks a possibility, a way to enter the world and make claims on circulation and on profits and power. From small fishing boats stitched together with balsa wood and rope to lumbering supertankers, leviathans of metal and machine, millions of vessels and millions of seafarers are currently afloat in the ocean. And here you can see a visualization of some of the cargo ships that are currently at sea. There are all of these open access websites where essentially you can find that tell you the position of each of the sort of over 20,000, over 100,000 container ships that are currently at sea. Some 90% of global trade, approximately 6 billion tons of cargo, travels on the over 100,000 cargo ships that are operated by over 1 million seafarers. The Western Indian Ocean is a central hub in this global economy, between 22,000 and 25,000 vessels transit through the Suez Canal each year. This contemporary mobility builds on longer histories of movement and exchange in the Indian Ocean, where by the 2nd century, a ring of coastal towns connected Mogadishu to Malacca, and along whose pathways traveled a dazzling array of material objects, free and unfree people, and from the 10th century onwards, a world religion, Islam. African mobility in the Indian Ocean is often understood within historical frameworks of unfree movement or specters of clandestine migration in recent years. Here, and in my larger projects, I foreground a more crowded world at sea, of traders, pirates, merchant mariners, and mercenaries, to understand a commingling of trade and raid, violence and intimacy, as well as the historical resonances that shape modes of engagement outside of frameworks of territoriality. In this talk, I focus on one specific vessel, the dhow, that was central to the making of a diasporic world in the Indian Ocean, stitching together people and places across monsoonal waters. Specifically drawing on over 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork, including work aboard dhows, I ask how we might imagine migration and mobility from the vantage points of ship holds and containers, and of relationships that are brief and fleeting at sea. A rich archive on the Atlantic as well as the Indian Ocean has emphasized how ships, as Paul Gilroy notes, those living microcultural, micropolitical systems are key sites to theorize mobility and its wake. Drawing from that scholarship, here today I read across oceans and temporalities to narrate the world of the dhow. In particular, I focus on what I call protection, which is linked to a way of claim-making that operates horizontally, that is tied neither to states, while of course states are certainly engaged in forms of protection, but here what I'm interested in are these temporary forms of horizontal claims over people, claims over routes that are not built on, claims over itineraries that are not built on territory or state making. So to kind of rescue protection from a larger story of state becoming and state belonging. Referring to a range of ships of differing sizes with names such as sanduks, jahazis, and wahans that crisscrossed the Western Indian Ocean before the advent of steam, the dhow with its single Latin sail is both an embodiment of the dense trade networks of the Western Indian Ocean, and since the advent of European incursions, the object of its regulation. As the historian Abdul Sharif poetically notes, the dhow is often imagined, and I quote, is often imagined as an uncouth vessel with a triangular Latin sail carrying a motley crew of Arabs. Its holds were filled with a miscellaneous cargo of Arab dates, dried fish, Indian and African timber, food grains, cotton, Indonesian spices, Chinese pottery, and African ivory, as well as passengers or slaves in every direction. So here you have a whole world of the Indian Ocean collected and contained within the hold. For Sharif and others, the dhow embodies this cosmopolitan ethos of this oceanic space, a polyglot world built on the circulation of objects, people, and ideas in the leaky holds of wooden ships that sailed according to the timeline of the monsoon. But the dhow by the 19th century was already a vestige of the past, seen as part of a traditional pre-modern trading world of slaves and spices. The dhow was for the British and other colonial powers an anachronism in an era of free trade and steamers. With the advent of decolonization and a certain post-colonial lockdown that happens across the Indian Ocean realm, a move away from the ocean, the dhow faded into the register of the nostalgic and the artisanal. And this comes from an archive, a sort of private archive of a sailor, and this was very much circulated in this realm of the dhow as nostalgia. But at the same, and you have these kind of maps that again highlight both the density of movement, its emphasis on monsoons, and this is a dhow map of the Red Sea moving across from Somalia to Yemen, and that's Aden, and it's a Gujarati map. And then you have steam with its more sort of straightforward lines and rigid timetables that come in the 19th century, and the dhow sort of disappears and as it's seen as both informal but also as an illegalized trade. But the Dao returns in the late 1980s and in some ways responding to a larger shift, a larger geopolitical shifts that happened with containerization. Containerization leads to ports, creates ports around the Indian Ocean where vessels cannot or will not go due to either sanctions or port capacity. So the Dao emerged then as a vessel of trade moving between, so here it is in Gujarat, so moving between places on the western coast of India to the Emirates, and where it was, and you can see containers that are coming in and it's decontainerizing and then putting vessels on and taking them to places as far as Yemen, Somalia, and increasingly these days Iran as a result of the sanctions. But most of my work was done in coastal Somalia with, as Dao ships came in. Laden with bulk goods arriving into the port cities of Somalia is a somewhat anachronistic experience. The buzz of ports, the buzz of the port, the longshoremen that mill about, the familiarity and friendship between boat captains and port inspectors who bond over cups of tea and speak a shared language of Bollywood-inflected Urdu beckons perhaps to a time before the container and the computer, a world where goods are loaded and unloaded by hand, where the logic of logistics does not reign supreme over the networks, both fleeting and deep, that constitute trading relations. But to see this world as a mere anachronism, as somewhat betwixt and between the era of port cities and container ports, is to ignore the just-in-time logics that constitute the global supply chains of this trade. It is to ignore the shifting nature of consumer demand, geopolitics, as well as national identity that are central to making impossible certain kinds of itineraries. The Dao trade in that sense is simultaneously old and new, diasporic and local. And from 2008, this trade ends up, in addition to linking Somalia through the sinews of commerce, became essential to the world of piracy that had emerged adjacent to and was imbricated within the sea of trade. So piracy in Somalia, unlike in other places, was a hijack and ransom economy. So it involved having ships that were held hostage brought to the Somali coast, and as a result of that, and waiting for ransoms. And as a result of that, other container ships stopped traveling in Somalia, and then you had those coming in to ports in northern Somalia, often with various kinds of agreements. But also what happened with the emergence of the naval fleets that came into the Red Sea from 2010 onwards was that those became central for pirates to both camouflage themselves in this world at sea, but also to extend this sort of time period and places that they could go. So by 2011, you have attacks happening almost close to India. So in a way, these larger legal transformations that are happening make Daos and pirates sort of central to sustaining each other. So as navies started policing internationally, what they called an internationally recommended transit corridor, pirate skiffs no longer provided the horsepower or the stability to make oceanic journeys necessary to hijack ships. Piracy transformed into a floating diaspora scattered across the Western Indian Ocean, with attacks occurring as close as 40 nautical miles off the coast of India. Central to the making of this diaspora, like the older diasporas of the Indian Ocean, was the Dao, transformed this time into the contemporary form of the 19th century mothership. During the height of the whaling boom in the 19th century, motherships were central to expanding the reach and of the whaling trade by functioning as a base from which smaller, faster cutters could be launched to chase and kill whales. Whale meat was then processed and stored in these larger ships. For whalers, motherships were both little floating factories, but ways of domesticating the sea, of extending intersubjective space-time in these watery domains. Instead of a vessel that allowed whalers to travel far and wide in search of the lumbering giants that illuminated the 19th century, the Dao as mothership enabled pirates to chase a different beast, the oil tanker that fuels contemporary globalization. Thous promise a modicum of stability in the open monsoonal waters of the Indian Ocean, as well as extended one's time that one could spend at sea. They made it possible to transform piracy into a Western Indian Ocean practice and to evade naval patrols. In addition, the Thou as mothership highlights another facet of the ship. In an inhospitable world, the mothership exists as a simultaneous place of refuge and violation, of hospitality and hostility. Recalling the moment of arrival when pirates arrived at his threshold, Rahimullah, a Thou captain, explained, "We had just left the port of Salalah in Oman when we heard on the radio that the Ali Babas, which is what he called pirates, had been seen by someone not far from where we were. Shipboard radios are a constant source of chatter at sea. Most of the time, these involve people sort of cursing at each other or playing bad music, but they also inform each other if anything is suspicious. As Rahimullah described it, they had left the port late at night, a practice common in Red Sea ports due to the unforgiving hot summers. All of a sudden, before we could head back, a small boat came alongside us," he said, "and fired shots. Alarmed at the gunshots, they slowed down their ship. We didn't know where they were, and we didn't want to get killed, so I cut the engine, and they boarded us. 'Were you scared?' I asked. 'Of course,' he replied somewhat dismissively. 'Why wouldn't I be scared? They had come aboard with guns.' But this was no ordinary hijacking. They were lost and had run out of water for drinking and for their boat. They stayed on our dhow for 3 days, and near Socotra, they got off and disappeared." Mothershipping is built on an ambivalence. Unlike the hijacking of ships, these boats are not ends in themselves, but rather means to certain kinds of ends. These moments of encounter between Thou crews and pirates are fraught with danger and potential violence. Crews are threatened and mistreated, supplies stolen, itineraries disrupted, and losses incurred. Yet, when these stories are told, whether to other seafarers or curious anthropologists, moments of accommodation and recognition are equally prevalent. Thinking through this minor literature of captivity narratives allows us to see these stories beyond mere ideology or a form of Stockholm syndrome, and also signals some temporary reversals that occur in this moment of capture. After Rahimullah described the initial violence of piracy, he turned to the hours, days of capture where meals were shared, movies were watched in the intimacy of the home. He, as well as other crew members, talked of how pirates would keep their guns away after a few days. This moment of disarmament does not structurally transform a relationship between pirate and Thou, or create a form of equivalence between guest and host. Instead, the anxiety and potential violence of arrival is deferred through an acknowledgement of disarmament. Rahimullah explained, when I asked him what he thought of the pirates, "Hum sab gharib log hain." Gharib, which is poor, signaled a form of recognition and a way of making pirates visible within a shared social and moral universe. Right? So Gharib was a way of extending that sense of recognition beyond just the pirate as the violator, but also as a shared traveler on this space. Alongside being mediated through material objects, this working of accommodation, what I call protection, is a jurisdictional claim tied to persons and spaces. In 19th century Somalia, a practice of aban was a guarantee of protection in return for payment for the duration of time one traversed through the space of that protector. Similarly, a genealogy of the practice of sanctuary highlights the role played by physical structures such as churches and in analogous ways to men's homes as spaces of protection and peace. The Thou similarly transforms into a space of protection in the moment after hijacking. The AK-47 put away, the meals shared, the DVDs watched are the material objects that mediate this relationship. Instead of a move from sympathy to disavowal, or what even Achille Mbembe calls the conviviality of the ruler and ruled, we have forms of acknowledgement, of temporary living together in the rocky hold of a ship. Hum sab gharib log hain, we are all poor, transforms the enemy of all into a fellow traveler. These everyday encounters are moments when the identities of hijacker and hostage, of pirate and merchant, are transformed and reconfigured, though not dissolved. Unlike the hold of other ships in other oceans and at other times, rendered hauntingly in the work of scholars such as Christina Sharp, what matters here and what distinguishes the Dao as mothership are prior histories and form of engagements that shape the temporality of capture. Consider, for example, the story of a former pirate, Awul, on what turned out to be an unsuccessful attempt of a hijacking. Awul and his crew got lost at sea. We were floating without food and water. I could only taste salt on my lips, he said. One of the crew members had tried to drink water from the sea and was in a miserable condition. As day turned into night, we saw a light. When I first saw this, I was worried that it was a jinn. And I decided that if it was a mischievous jinn, and the world at sea is full of all of these spirits, including jinns, and when I decided if it was a mischievous jinn, there was nothing I could do to resist it. So we set out in pursuit of the lights. And then suddenly a heavily loaded Indian dhow came into view. We were so happy when we got on board. It was a sign from God, and then when we returned, I gave up piracy. Awul's recognition of jinns is one familiar to many Dao captains and part of a shared idiom of understanding encounters at sea. These social relations, I argue, are what transform the violence of capture into a temporary form of cohabitation. The Taoist mothership is built on and sustained through these forms of relatedness that emerge in the hold, but crucially exceed the spatial and temporal time of capture. So this is, again, not to deny the forms of violence that exist in these moments of captivity, but to look primarily, again, and it's negotiated through food, it's the way in which these forms of cohabitation allow for certain kinds of reversal. And one of the most common ones was often the ship crew, the ship captains were the ones who had more of the nautical skills. Right? Pirates were often lost or had no idea what they were doing. So there was a way of, in their stories that both ship captains would tell, they would talk of that as a way of not being captured, as still holding on to certain forms of power. And similarly, pirates would narrate this as being a martivyat, which is hospitality. And so working through that and thinking of how that continues to frame within a framework of geopolitics and long histories, a world of drones and post-Panamax shipping, Dao's motherships offer the continuing presence of protection. Alongside contests over sovereignty and value, this world of protection is constituted through, and these are the kinds of holds that one spends time in, and these are the ships that pirates would find themselves in. And the green flag is very similar to what you would find on shrines as well across this region. So these everyday forms of encounter that nonetheless remain linked to the extraordinary violence of hijackings and the violence of counter-piracy is important to highlight here. Thinking through the materiality of these encounters has been an exercise in thinking about problems of moving across scales and temporality, as well as reflecting on spaces that exceed binaries of colonizer and colonized, native and settler. Instead of what Eng Seng Ho calls a parochial geography that is tied to terrestrial states, this banality of capture seeks to open up an expansive frame, which, as scholars such as Ann Stoler have noted, bring into view mobile politics of dislocation that are dependent not on stable populations, but on highly movable ones. It is this politics and practice of mobility that this talk has sought to sketch out through a focus on mothershipping in the Western Indian Ocean. The ambiguities of capture and its emphasis on everyday forms of recognition and engagement were underscored to me during my last encounter with Awul, the ex-pirate. I asked him what he remembered most about his time on board the Dao. Without a moment's pause, he answered, "The food. Indian food is way too spicy for me." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dua. If I could please ask all three panelists to take a seat. I will then ask everyone one or two questions, and then hand over to you as the audience for a few Q&As. So what diverse and fascinating presentations from such different areas and contexts, yet stitched together by similarities in themes such as identity, questionings of territoriality, of belonging, and obviously countering narratives on migration. Dr. Overmeyer Velasquez, I appreciate your move to ensure that diverse origins and destinations receive a balanced academic treatment through the ongoing literature. You mentioned that a non-American vantage point challenges our epistemological and ontological assumptions, and I admire the move towards opening up and expanding our theoretical orientations in doing so. I wanted to ask if your claim of this is true because it is to the necessary exclusion of US empirical and theoretical work, or if it's an expansion beyond US-centered theory of Latinx identity formation. Your paper asserts a desire to chart new ontological and epistemological cartographies. And I would like to ask, beyond or in expansion of your discussion of a comparative impulse, which theoretical frameworks and methodological imperatives might help to further move the creation of these frameworks and cartographies. My first question for Dr. Constable, thank you for a rich paper on non-citizenship and the notion of excluded belonging. You strongly articulate that non-citizens are not the inverse of citizens and use terms such as differential inclusion and excluded belonging to show this, and to show that there exists a heterogeneity of notions associated with that of being a non-citizen through a state of permanent temporariness. Your work reminded me of a similar move, a theoretical move by Parita Chatterjee to articulate citizens, what he calls in political society, as a form also of almost temporary, permanent temporariness, or constantly being at the whims of civil society. And so I wanted to ask if it is necessarily the non-citizens' status of people that creates this excluded belonging or this differential inclusion. And there are obviously overlaps, and if we articulate those overlaps, how might one inform the other? And then lastly, Dr. Dewar, thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. I also appreciate you showing how post-colonial nationalism shaped and shapes shipping and shipping methods across the Indian Ocean. You mentioned that you engage with frameworks outside of territoriality. Are these frameworks necessarily outside territoriality, or do we need building on your substantive and empirical work here to expand and challenge our notions of territoriality, and building on the work of scholars such as Neil Brenner or Henri Lefebvre? Do we need to reconceptualize how we see the state and capital in its relationship to territoriality and the creation of different and new modes of space and spatial practice? And with that, I would like to hand over to the panel, and then we'll open up to all of you. Thank you.
Is this on? It is. Hello. Brandon, thank you for your questions. I'll answer it this way. I mean, I think about how part of the purpose of the paper emerged from a frustration around how to situate these kinds of conversations within U.S. academia, where I was formed and where I situate myself, and wanting to do questions about the kind of exclusion or expansion of. So I think the answer is both, right? The ability to draw on lessons learned from U.S. ethnic studies within these larger global contexts, and at the same time, these kinds of questions, because of these new geographic dispersions and new destinations for these populations, aren't considering, for example, the experience of people from Latin America outside of the U.S. context. So there's a real rigidity in U.S. ethnic studies to even think about people's very being and belonging in spaces outside of the U.S. And at the same time, there's a lot of valuable ways, kind of methodological ways of theorizing the experiences of people outside of the U.S. that I think we can, especially around questions of racialization, the kind of labor practices, their colonial experiences, all these other things that we look to within ethnic studies, and in particular U.S. Latino studies, that I found helpful to start to think about the experience of Latin American and Caribbean diaspora outside of the particular U.S. context. So it's an early moment in this. There's been very, very little done, in part because I think we've seen a real fundamental shift in where people are moving, the movement of it. And admittedly, my study lacks the empirical richness of my colleagues here at the table. You know, this is a real kind of open theoretical intervention, and I haven't had the time and a lot of people haven't done the work of thinking about, you know, what does this mean on the ground in terms of creations of emergent identities, of the relationship with other minoritized populations, about the relationship back to their home countries in Latin America. So much more needs to be done, but this is, from my location at the kind of intersection of area and ethnic studies, this is one way for me to kind of satisfy my, kind of deal with my frustrations and things.
So thank you for your question, Brandon. It's a good setup, I think, for the paper I've been working on after that one, which is more specifically looking to de-exceptionalize displacement in relation to looking at alliances between citizens and non-citizens and ways in which they share particular precarities. And so I think you're right that the non-citizen status is one factor, but it's not the only factor. And there are factors that citizens experience as well that make them, in some ways, as precarious. And so what I end up trying to talk to, because I was very much isolated, I think, as an Asian studies scholar in my view of migration, is to look at some of the European migration and refugee literature, and now a lot more of the Latin American US migration literature as well, and some of the ways that we construct the migrant category or the mobile person category versus the citizen or the partial citizenship or the permanent temporariness and all those terms, that none of them for me got quite to that particular process and condition of what exactly is going on. And I think that can be across the board, not just for migrants, but useful, I think, intervention among migration scholars. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Brandon, for your question. And absolutely, you know, in a similar way, I also don't want to essentialize a land-sea dichotomy here. And in some ways, I'm trying to work against, you know, initially, sort of, there's a sense of a lot of, especially amongst kind of post-colonial scholarship, there was an initial mode of sea blindness, a way in which the story of kind of post-colonial nationalism is one very much tied to land, but there's obvious, and in that sense, and the making of a national market, right? So if we look at political economies of the nation, and that is a legacy of a certain way of imagining kind of a intellectual genealogy from like Smith to Marx, and part of what I've been trying to do in this work, and part of what I find scholarship on the Indian Ocean has been very generative, has been to look at the movement across both land and sea, and in the sense that, so it's not to replace sort of sea blindness with a form of, you know, kind of land blindness, or like to just imagine that the sea is everything, but the sea is history, as Derek Walcott has reminded us. But the sea is also the beginnings of capital, and it's, you know, Brodell's way of thinking about the centrality of the ocean for the emergence of capitalism. Similarly, Janet Abdullah Good's work. So one of the things that has allowed me to think of regions as regions, and in the sense that there is nothing surprising that Gujarati seafarers show up in coastal Somalia. And so part of that has been to think of how we might narrate that form of mobility at one level, is not through a lens of sort of surprise, but rather through this emphasis on historical resonance. And then secondly, to move as my interlocutors did, and as Somali ways of imagining like land and sea, the sea is often seen as the equivalent of the desert, and therefore Aban, which was a landed-based idea of protection, was used to explain how one imagines being a pirate at sea. So it's to work with that metaphor, work constantly with what is the sea like, and when is the sea, when is it the desert, and in some ways, yeah. So I don't see this as an either or, but rather looking at region formation as these sort of processes and projects that move across the land-sea binary. So, great, thanks.
Okay, we can take questions for the next, how long, 10, 15 minutes? 5 minutes? 10 minutes.
Hi. I just had a question, and this probably concerns the first two papers more, and actually some of the earlier papers. What's striking as a kind of current, I guess to use a sea metaphor, that's running through, it seems like a number of the papers today is more within the European context that has been referred to as super diversity, right? The diversity within diversity, or noting ever more forms of heterogeneity within populations that we like to imagine as somehow bounded in certain ways. And I kind of wonder, is there a danger in kind of, what is the analytic purchase of kind of almost always wanting to find more heterogeneity within populations that we like to homogenize or bound? And does that have a danger of kind of just it becoming a kind of fetish, a kind of argumental fetish, in which we just kind of try to find ever more forms of heterogeneity? And what types of interlocutors are we imagining that are making these kind of claims? And I'm just kind of curious to kind of ask that.
So I do think that finding ever more heterogeneity is not the point or the end point. I think that looking at heterogeneity and then bouncing it always off of assumptions of similarities and building sort of bridges and understanding alliances between heterogeneities is more useful. So, for example, by looking at a very particular group, which is actually more and more and more and more micro of, not just migrant workers, but migrant workers who are mothers, who've overstayed, who, that by getting to know them really well and the processes of what they're struggling with, and then seeing how there actually are connections between that and what Cheryl described this morning in her paper on Cambodians and Vietnamese and other people in the US. It's the Hong Kong context, I think, is remarkably similar to some of what's going on in the US and some of what's going on in Europe and different parts of the world in terms of an increasingly hostile climate toward mobile people and minorities. And so I think that it's not, I think the homogeneity, the heterogeneity is important to look at, but it's from those cases that you actually can see the similarities. So I don't think it's ever total super diversity. It's bouncing back and forth between patterns and processes and conditions that are similar despite the particularities of any individual ethnographic case.
I can go to. Okay. Yeah, just sort of quickly bouncing off that. I think part of what all of these papers are illustrating, or what I found very provocative and interesting, is not necessarily a kind of division between heterogeneity and homogeneity, but rather the possibility of comparison, right? And the possibility of comparing across space that happens when one doesn't imagine these as questions that are tied to a particular region, right? And in an intellectual genealogy that then is sort of central to that region, right? So Asian studies and versus like Latinx versus sort of Indian Ocean. And I think part of, so I would say that there's a misrecognition, that it's not, or like heterogeneity is a moment in allowing for a certain way of thinking across comparison. And I think there's an interesting question of what comparison today looks like. And partly there's a political urgency to that, in the sense that so many of our interlocutors are often find themselves comparing across places and space. And in my case, across temporalities, like what time are we in matters. And so comparativism in anthropology had a moment of flourishing, and then kind of was seen as very, very sort of systematic, rigid, and disappeared. But I think there's a way in which keeping that heterogeneity while simultaneously thinking across differences is what's at stake in doing these kinds of projects.
The only thing I'll add is part of the question feels, from the U.S. perspective, has a lot of relevance as we kind of expand and think about kind of the multiplicity of identities and how we understand them and people's positionalities here. But also, I think about scholarship in, what I know best in Latin America, and how these questions of heterogeneity are kind of really emergent in the past decade or so, and that to really think about identities and locations and movement and mobilities is something much newer, and then I think has a lot more kind of political power in Latin America. So again, I'd wonder about where the question is located, right? Is it about the U.S. scholarship, U.S. Ways of thinking and theorizing? Is it speaking from a position from the global South and Latin America? I think you have different kinds of answers to that same question.
We have time for one or two more.
So I guess I have a question both for Mark and for Nicole. Oh, sorry, I forgot. So, Mark, I really liked the talk, and I was thinking a lot about the historiography of Latin America, and thinking about, part of a regional identity as a receiver of immigrants, right? That's part of the narrative that you're pushing against, right? A receiver of immigrants until it becomes a sender of migrants to the United States. And so you're kind of challenging that. And I'm trying to think historically, and you said a little bit about this in your talk, but when you start seeing that shift, when you start seeing Latin America as a place that produces migrants outside of the Western Hemisphere. So I kind of want you to locate that for me a little bit temporally, a little bit more. But then related to that, because as I understood your discussion, that has to do with the closing of legal pathways into the United States. So I'm wondering, when you think about all of these connectors that help create a kind of, or help to flavor the kind of Latinx identity in Jordan or whatever location that you're thinking about. You talk about all the ways that reinforce this identity have to do with labor exploitation and inequality and networks of solidarity, and I wonder about legal status as part of that. And I was actually inspired by Nicole's paper to think about that, like the importance of legal status in this very creation in the first place. So that's, I guess my question has to do with how significant is legal status and the barrier to legal status in the very formation of a kind of Latinx identity in Jordan or elsewhere? That would be my question for you. And then Nicole, in a similar way, your paper was in some ways talked so much about the significance of legal status and these barriers that formed a kind of excluded sense of belonging, and I wondered about home country as also one of these connectives that are important to the women that you've talked about, because those were the categories that were salient in one presentation and a little bit absent in the other presentation. So I kind of wanted to put those two together.
So, thanks, Tori. To the first question, the historical moment, and is as I mentioned, so we have increased out-migration to non-U.S. destinations really towards the end of the 20th century. I mean, increasingly over time, if you look at the graph, right, with the building of, the increased militarization of the border from from the 60s through 2000, and then of course peaking through 9/11. That's when we see the shift away, the change in directions, where you have most people not now going to the United States, but rather to either jumping over the U.S. to go straight to Canada, or increasingly to Europe. And it coincides with, for example, and there's different moments. Like, for example, in the 90s, there was a big flow of South Americans to Israel. There was also, people going to Spain when Spain changed its immigration rules. But that, at the same time, that it became more and more increasingly difficult to get to the United States, that happened as well. And speaking of that, what I didn't say, and I'll admittedly don't know a lot about, is the kind of to your second question about the status of these immigrants. And of course, each country varies. In Jordan, I see sort of three different streams of migrants coming from Latin America. One is through foreign service and connecting to, being in Amman through embassies and embassy work. Two is through education, getting there into, because Jordan and Amman is a big educational center in the Middle East. And then some of them coming from after what was a growth of Latin American immigrants in Israel, and that has a long, fascinating history about, after the Second Intifada, how Israel brought in Latin American migrants, and then after that they were also deported, and so we see some of those coming into places in Jordan. The status that they have depends on those. So one will have sort of student visa, one will be connected through foreign departments, and then the other ones, I'm not entirely sure how they play out, but there's like these other papers, there's multiplicity of belonging and non-belonging that complicates that.
Thanks for your question. The issue of connectedness to the home country is, for most migrant domestic workers, is something non-problematic, like they normally go back every time they're done with their contract and then come back again, or they go home for periods of time. But the particular situation for the ones who become mothers in Hong Kong is that it's often very difficult for them to return home as single mothers. And so the gendered factors really come into play. There's a lot of stigma, especially for the ones who return to Indonesia, to go back with a child and without the father of the child. And even if they've had like a nikah ceremony in Hong Kong, that's not really considered valid unless the guy is there with them or sending money. And in most cases, that doesn't happen. So in some cases, it was the guy left them when she got pregnant, or in some cases, the relationships continue. But it's the stigma of either having much darker skinned children when they go back, if the father was African, or going back with a child out of wedlock. And also, since most of them that I'm talking about have filed the non-refoulement claims, they don't even have their passports anymore. They're not considered legally belonging to those countries, and their children have never been there. They've never been anywhere but Hong Kong. Some of them go to Chinese schools, and the issue of the children is a really central one that I didn't really have time to get into, but the children are viewed as completely disconnected from the home countries, and their education is what the mothers are putting huge emphasis on, including two of the mothers with very special needs children who think that in the Philippines or in Indonesia, the children will just have no future at all, whereas in Hong Kong, they think that they do. So in their particular cases, they feel quite a disconnection to their home countries, but that's not the norm among most migrant workers. But in the next paper that I'm writing about, I'm looking at both how their own governments, for the Indonesian migrant workers, their own consulate often creates greater precarity for them, and it's a factor in combination with Hong Kong, so that the home country and the home government isn't necessarily helping them. It can, in some particular situations, make it much worse. So that begins to get at it anyway.
I think we have time for one quick question, and then we have to wrap up.
I'm just wondering about the mothers. You're saying most of them are domestic workers?
They all originally came to Hong Kong as domestic workers with 2-year contracts and visas, and
Well,
some
I just
repeatedly.
wonder, it is a total, what kind of support where they're domestic workers? Obviously, can I say that they're doing work that other people don't want to do? That's why they're there. But what kind of support or help or reaction are they getting from the people who have employed them and brought them in?
Yeah.
Are they getting any support?
Well,
and if so,
legally,
what?
legally they're allowed to get pregnant by the labor laws in Hong Kong, but almost always as soon as they do, the employers terminate their contracts or give them notice. And they're not allowed to by law for that reason, but they can either find other reasons to terminate them, and a few cases have gone to court under the issue of gender discrimination because they're not allowed to fire them for being pregnant. And some of the domestic workers have won, but they haven't really won anything to even make up for the lost salary. So almost all the mothers who I knew overstayed their visas, and they might have worked illegally as domestic workers, or illegally, or once you're an asylum seeker, you're technically not allowed to work. So you're completely dependent on handouts and charity to support yourself, unless you want to work under the table, which some people do, but that's become increasingly difficult to do. But you're absolutely right. About a fifth of households in Hong Kong hire women from, I'd say more than 95% are from the Philippines and Indonesia to do domestic work and childcare and elderly care and work that the local people don't want to do. And it allows them to go out and work for more, for more money.
Thank you so much to the 3 panelists for a fabulous session. I think we'll break now and return at 2 p.m. Thank you so much.
Thank you.